A fire once whispered its secrets in ash, and from that silence, a buried truth clawed its way back into the light. What began as a cry for help soon unraveled into a labyrinth of guilt, deception, and a legacy too dangerous to forget. In the shadows of old maps and darker motives, a single question lingers. How far would you go to erase the past? Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was upon a wind-blown evening in late October that I found myself once again at Baker Street, the familiar scent of coal smoke and old books mingling comfortingly with the sharper tang of Turkish tobacco. Holmes, ensconced in his customary armchair by the fire, had not long returned from a case in Sussex and was in one of his more genial moods, a state which, while rare, rendered his company unusually bearable for extended conversation. As I removed my gloves and took my place opposite him, Holmes regarded me with his characteristic half-lidded gaze and a faint upward twitch of the lip. "You have been at the British Geographical Society," he remarked, with a tone so casual that it might have been mistaken for indifference had it not landed with such accuracy. I raised an eyebrow. "Indeed I have. But how on earth—" "My dear Watson," he interrupted gently, "your boots betray you. That distinctive ochre smudge upon the left heel is peculiar to the flagstone steps outside the Geographical Society, which I observed once when accompanying Lord Hollingford. Moreover, the smear of ink on your right cuff, still damp, suggests a careless note hastily jotted with a scholar's pen, and the faint aroma of parchment and archival dust, which lingers still upon your coat, completes the portrait." I could do little but smile, though privately I marvelled, as ever, at his uncanny precision. Yet before I could offer a proper response, there came a disturbance that would draw our attention far from parlour tricks and comfortable deduction. A sudden, urgent knock rang out against the panelled door, sharp and uneven, as though the knocker's hand trembled with fear or haste. Holmes straightened perceptibly, and I saw the flicker of interest leap to life behind his eyes. Rarely did the hour bring a casual visitor, and still less one so clearly distraught. "Come," Holmes called, and Mrs. Hudson's footsteps could be heard hastening to the entrance below. A murmur of voices followed, then the hurried scuff of feet ascending the stair. The door swung open without ceremony to reveal a young woman, pale-faced and wide-eyed, her gloved hands clutching something tightly wrapped in a silk scarf. Her hair was dark, unkempt by the wind, and her breath came in short, anxious gasps. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice fragile but determined, "you must forgive the intrusion. I did not know where else to turn." Holmes rose at once and gestured to the chair beside the hearth. "You are quite safe here, madam. Sit, if you please, and tell us what has brought you to our door at such an hour." She did not sit. Instead, she unwrapped the object in her hands with trembling fingers. The silk fell away to reveal a torn and blackened parchment, its edges singed and brittle, the centre marred by soot and ash. Though much of it was illegible, a few markings remained visible: compass lines, faded annotations, and a curiously intricate border which bore the hallmarks of an antique cartographer's hand. Holmes stepped forward and examined the fragment without touching it. "A map," he said quietly. "Or rather, what remains of one." The woman swallowed hard. "It belonged to my father," she said. "Professor Reginald Danforth. Perhaps you know the name." Holmes nodded faintly. "Explorer. Cartographer. Died last spring, did he not? An unexpected fall in the Caucasus, if I recall the obituary correctly." Her lips trembled, but she steadied herself. "Yes, only I no longer believe it was an accident. 2 nights ago, I received a letter. No signature, no address, just a demand. Return the map or suffer the consequence. I panicked. I burned it. She looked at us then, her eyes shining with a kind of desperate clarity. I thought I was destroying a thing of danger, but now I fear I destroyed the one thing that could explain what truly happened to him. Holmes regarded her for a long moment, and I could see the gears turning behind his calm expression. "Miss Danforth," he said at last, "I believe you were quite right to come to me." Miss Eleanor Danforth stood before us, her slender frame tense, her gloved hands still shaking despite Holmes's invitation to sit. There was a pallor to her face that suggested not mere physical exhaustion, but a deeper anxiety, the kind that gnaws steadily at the spirit. She remained standing by the hearth, her eyes flickering between Holmes and the charred fragment of the map that now rested gently upon the side table. "My father," she began, her voice low and measured, "was Professor Reginald Danforth. You may have known of him by reputation." "I am familiar with his expeditions," Holmes replied without embellishment. His work on the disputed boundaries in the Persian Gulf, in particular, earned him considerable academic notoriety, though not without controversy. She nodded faintly. "He returned from his final journey this past spring. Or rather, he did not return at all. His body was found at the base of a ravine in the Caucasus, broken, as though he had fallen. There was no witness, only his journal and this map, which he had taken great care to conceal. I observed, not for the first time, the quiet intelligence in her gaze, the sort that marked grief not as a passing affliction, but as a furnace which had refined her composure into steel. "And now," she said with a tight breath, "I begin to suspect that my father's death was no accident at all." Holmes leaned forward slightly, steepling his fingers. "Please, Miss Danforth," he said, "tell us precisely what leads you to that suspicion." Her answer, when it came, was neither hysterical nor wild, but instead methodical, as though she had rehearsed it silently each night in dread. "The map," she said, with a glance toward the blackened parchment, "was among his belongings when they were returned to me by the Foreign Office. It was tucked into the lining of his travel coat. I knew it must have been important, but I did not understand it. It bore no name, no legend, only coordinates, strange markings, and my father's handwriting along the edges, filled with references I could not decipher." She paused, as though momentarily lost in the memory of handling the thing, perhaps weighing even then the danger it might represent. "A few weeks later," she continued, "I received the first of the letters. It was anonymous. The writing was blockish, artificial, obviously disguised. It read only, 'Return what is not yours. You are in danger.' I showed it to no one. I thought it the work of a crank." Holmes did not interrupt, his gaze fixed upon her with studious intensity. Then another arrived, more urgent. It named my father. It said he had taken what belonged to others, and that I would answer for it if I did not surrender the map. I confess I acted rashly. I was frightened, alone, and I did the one thing I now regret most." She turned her eyes toward me as though seeking absolution. "I burned it," she said simply, "or tried to. I had the fire going already. I tore it in half and fed it into the flames, but it did not burn quickly. I snatched what I could when the edges began to curl and smothered them. What you see there is all that remains." Holmes remained silent, but his eyes shifted toward the map. After a long moment, he spoke, not to her, but seemingly to himself. "To destroy a map," he said, "is not unlike blinding oneself before entering a maze. It may spare you the horror of what lies ahead, or it may ensure you never find your way out." Holmes rose from his chair and crossed to the side table. He bent slightly over the scorched remnants, examining them without touching the fragile surface. I could see the minute flickers of perception working through his features, The narrowing of the brow, the faint contraction at the corners of his mouth, the way his fingers hovered but never quite settled. "There is precision in the burn," he said finally. "Though it masquerades as panic, these edges are not entirely accidental. You burned the map hastily, yes, but not wholly indiscriminately." Eleanor's lips parted in confusion. "I don't understand." "Someone wanted this map gone," Holmes said. "But if your instinct led you to preserve part of it, even subconsciously, then it suggests you feared destroying it entirely. Or perhaps some part of you knew that its obliteration would not end the danger." He turned to her. "Did your father ever mention the map to you directly? Speak of any expedition in recent years that troubled him?" She shook her head. He became withdrawn in his final months. He spoke often of legacy, of redemption, but he did not confide in me. "Legacy and redemption," Holmes echoed. "An unusual vocabulary for a cartographer." I knew then that Holmes had committed himself to the mystery, though he had not yet declared it aloud. Holmes returned to his seat, folding his hands once more in the thoughtful pose I had come to associate with the onset of serious engagement. The flicker of amusement that often played across his features during lesser puzzles had vanished entirely. He was now the calculating machine, cool, deliberate, and precise. "You have done what few would have dared, Miss Danforth," he said. "You destroyed an artifact whose value you could not measure, in an attempt to sever the danger at its root. That shows not cowardice, but a kind of desperate courage." She gave a weak smile. "And yet it seems to have only drawn the danger closer." "Indeed," Holmes replied, "which is precisely why I shall assist you." I could not help but lean forward slightly. "You believe her father was murdered?" "I believe," Holmes said carefully, "that Professor Danforth discovered something of value to dangerous men. Whether that value is scientific, cultural, or criminal remains to be seen. But if this map was at the center of it, then its destruction will not have extinguished the interest of those who pursue it." He turned to Eleanor once more, and though his voice remained calm, there was steel in its undertone. "Miss Danforth, I shall undertake your case, but I must ask for your absolute honesty from this moment forward. If there is anything, no matter how small, that you have not yet disclosed, now is the time." She nodded, her expression solemn. "You shall have it, Mr. Holmes, whatever I know." Our first step took us to the venerable halls of the British Geographical Society, an institution whose very architecture exuded the solemn dignity of empire and exploration. Professor Danforth had held honorary residence in the Society's East Wing, a small chamber reserved for distinguished fellows. It was here that Holmes requested access to the late cartographer's workroom. A request which, when coupled with Holmes's reputation, was met with deference rather than delay. The room itself bore the stillness of neglect, though not the dust-laden silence of true abandonment. Holmes's gaze swept the shelves, where parchment rolls lay bundled with twine, some of them half unfurled, as though disturbed mid-study. A glass cabinet had been left ajar, its interior exhibiting signs of recent handling. Holmes made no pronouncement at first, only moved with quiet deliberation from one item to the next, pausing now and then to examine a surface for smudges or to sniff faint traces in the air. The intruder was not thorough, he murmured at last. They sought something precise and in haste. "You believe someone broke in after the professor's death?" I asked. "Undoubtedly. These marks," he gestured to a faint scuff on the windowsill, "speak of entry by stealth, not by invitation." On the desk he found a torn page tucked beneath an atlas. It bore nothing but a fragment of coordinates and a note in Danforth's unmistakable hand. "Not by latitude, by legacy." Holmes pocketed it without comment. "There is more to be found," he said, eyes narrowing, "but not here." And with that, he turned on his heel directing us to our next point of inquiry, the place where Danforth's true intentions might yet reside, hidden not in public archives, but in private memory. Our second visit that day was to the Danforth residence, a modest but well-appointed home in Queen's Gate, where Eleanor had preserved much of her father's personal effects. It was there, in a chest beneath the bedroom window, that Holmes unearthed a small, leather-bound journal bound with a narrow ribbon, inconspicuous to the casual eye, but placed with too much care to be dismissed as trivial. He untied the ribbon and began to leaf through its contents. The entries were sparse, written in a mixture of English and a private cipher that Holmes, after a moment's study, identified as a variation of the visionnaire method, favoured by military men and, more discreetly, by certain foreign correspondents of Holmes's acquaintance. The passages we could decipher revealed a man increasingly at war with his conscience. One line stood out in particular. "I marked the place, but to possess it would be a theft of spirit as well as soil. They warned me. I did not heed." Holmes read it aloud, then fell into silence. "It would appear," he said at last, "that Professor Danforth came into possession of something he believed morally, not merely legally, dubious. A find of great consequence, perhaps not rightly his to reveal." He closed the journal and handed it to Eleanor without ceremony. "Guard this. Its significance may outweigh the map you destroyed." "But what does it mean?" she asked, her voice low. Holmes turned to the window. "It means we are not dealing with mere treasure hunters. There is a deeper hand at work, and one guided not by greed alone, but perhaps by ideology." With that, he asked to see the last man who had worked closely with the professor before his untimely end. We found Thomas Layton in the reading room of the Society's private library, hunched over a sheaf of charts and naval logs. He was a man of perhaps 35 years, with thinning hair, a nervous disposition, and a voice that bore the practiced polish of the academic, precise but devoid of warmth. Holmes introduced himself with customary brevity, and after a moment's hesitation, Layton agreed to a brief interview in one of the adjoining chambers. "I assisted Professor Danforth with cartographic restorations," he explained. "His final project, the one he took to the Caucasus, was confidential. He spoke little of it, even to me." Holmes's tone remained cordial, though I could sense the tightening of the net. "Did he ever mention the contents of the map Miss Danforth recently destroyed?" Layton looked genuinely startled. "No, sir. I had no knowledge that such a map existed." Holmes steepled his fingers. "And yet the professor's journal makes reference to a marked location and a warning unheeded. Surely, if he trusted anyone, it would have been you." A flicker crossed Layton's features. Not guilt, precisely, but discomfort. "I believe he may have feared exposure. There were men, correspondents from the East, who visited in those final weeks. Strangers, not of the academic sort." Holmes leaned forward. "You said nothing of this before." "I was not asked." "Mr. Layton, you're withholding something. Not out of malice, I think, but fear." At this, Layton's voice dropped to a whisper. "He told me only once in passing that he had seen something buried, something that should have remained undisturbed. He said it would be safer to forget than to reveal." I thought it the rambling of a man too long abroad. Holmes said nothing for a time. Then, "We shall require a list of all who visited him in his final weeks, particularly those who were not scholars." Layton hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Very well. But please understand, Mr. Holmes, I want no part in whatever this is." Holmes's response was mild but firm. "You already are, Mr. Layton, whether you like it or not." We returned once more to Miss Danforth's home in the late afternoon. The rain had begun to fall with a steady rhythm, and the scent of damp stone lingered as we stepped inside. Eleanor led us without word to the fireplace, where the ashes of the map still lay in a metal tray, preserved since the night she had attempted its destruction. "I could not bring myself to sweep it away," she confessed, her voice subdued. "I thought perhaps something might still be read from it." Holmes crouched low and examined the charred remnants, using a delicate pair of tweezers to lift the fragments. To my surprise, he found more than mere paper. Tucked beneath the scorched edges of the map were 3 half-burned notes, their ink partially legible despite the fire's reach. Each bore a single sentence in the same crude hand Miss Danforth had described. The first read, "You cannot hide what you do not understand." The second, "We are not thieves, we are keepers." And the last, "This is your final warning." Holmes laid them gently side by side and studied their phrasing. "These are not the words of common extortionists," he murmured. "There is a tone here, one of righteousness, a belief in moral entitlement." "What could they want?" Eleanor asked. "If the map is gone—" Holmes looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "They may not want the map at all. They may want what your father knew, or what he left behind." He rose then, and I could sense the weight of the case pressing upon him. "There is one more detail to confirm," he said softly, "and it lies in the way the fire failed to finish its work." Holmes gestured for a basin of cold water, into which he gently dipped one of the less scorched edges. As the moisture seeped into the fibres, the paper unfurled just enough to reveal a curious detail. The burn had travelled with unusual uniformity, curling along a tight arc, as though guided. "Do you see this, Watson?" he asked quietly. "These are not the wild licks of panic, but the precision of someone aiming to obscure, not obliterate." I bent closer, and indeed the edges showed signs of having been pinched or dampened in places, as if protected from the flame. "You believe Miss Danforth meant to preserve a portion?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "I believe someone else had already done so. The fire was not the first attempt to edit this map." Eleanor frowned. "But no one else had access to it." Holmes met her gaze steadily. "Unless they did, before it ever reached your hands." He turned back to the fragment, eyes sharp with thought. "What remains may have been intended to mislead, should the map fall into unapproved possession. A final act of obfuscation by your father, or by someone who did not want its true meaning deciphered." There was silence in the room as the implications took hold. What had begun as a tale of anonymous threats now bore the marks of deeper planning, and of truths too dangerous to be plainly written. Holmes straightened. "We are no longer searching for a map. We are searching for what it concealed, and why." It was scarcely a day after our return from Miss Danforth's residence that the next blow fell. Swift and unanticipated. I had only just returned to Baker Street from a morning errand, when I found Holmes pacing before the hearth, his brow furrowed in a way I had come to associate not with puzzlement, but with tightly controlled urgency. "There has been an incident," he said without preamble. "Miss Danforth has vanished." "Vanished?" I echoed, incredulous. "But we saw her but yesterday. She was to catalogue the remaining fragments of her father's papers." "She did not arrive at her solicitor's office this morning, as planned, nor has she returned home. Her maid reports that she left just after breakfast, carrying a parcel wrapped in oilcloth, and has not been seen since." The implication struck me at once. "You suspect abduction?" Holmes gave a curt nod. "There is more. A constable from Wapping telegraphed just now. A young lady's hat, consistent with Miss Danforth's description, has been found near the embankment, not far from the old shipyard warehouses. There are signs of disturbance on the river path." Without another word, Holmes retrieved his coat and cane, and within minutes we were in a cab rattling toward the Thames. It was a silence of urgency that filled the carriage, broken only when Holmes spoke in a low voice. "We must move swiftly, Watson. I fear this disappearance was neither spontaneous nor unforeseen. It bears the hallmarks of a calculated move, one designed not to silence Miss Danforth, but to draw us off course." As we approached the docks, I could not shake the dreadful feeling that our inquiry, once merely curious, had now stepped into something far more perilous, and perhaps irreversible. The river was grey and sullen as we approached the old embankment, its muddy banks littered with debris and the skeletal remnants of abandoned boats. A constable met us by the iron railing and led us to the site where the hat had been discovered. It was a simple thing, trimmed in faded blue ribbon, unmistakably Eleanor's. It lay upon the stone beside a disturbed patch of gravel where footprints had scuffed in multiple directions. A short distance beyond, drag marks suggested some struggle, though the rain had already begun to blur the evidence. Holmes crouched low, examining the scene with painstaking focus. He moved little and said less, though I noted the stiffness in his shoulders, a sign that the calm surface of his mind was troubled beneath. "There were two men," he said finally. "One taller than the other. The weight of his step impressed more deeply into the soft edge near the jetty. The second wore heels, narrower, angled, a military gait perhaps." He gestured to the railing. "See the scuff here? She resisted." I felt a chill, though not from the wind. "Then she was taken?" Holmes rose. "It is the likeliest conclusion, but not for ransom, nor for mere menace. Miss Danforth was carrying something. If my suspicions are correct, it was a fragment or a clue she discovered in her father's papers after our departure. She would not have told us yet, not until she was certain." "Then what do we do now?" I asked. Holmes's expression hardened. "We follow the trail as it bends, Watson. But be warned, we are no longer merely observers. We have become participants in a game whose rules are being rewritten even as we play." Later that afternoon, while Holmes pursued a line of inquiry among his more discreet contacts in the docks, he dispatched me to the Geographical Society with instructions to review any remaining items catalogued under Danforth's name. Though the Society's staff remained cooperative, their records were, as Holmes had warned, patchy and inconsistently filed. It was in a small bundle of correspondence, bundled and misfiled under expeditions unconfirmed, that I found the item which caused me to pause. Tucked between a shipping invoice and a receipt for photographic plates was a slip from a chemist's shop in Kensington, dated 2 weeks before the professor's death. It bore Thomas Layton's name. The items listed were unusual: sulfur, charcoal, nitrate of potash, the components of gunpowder, or, more specifically, a rudimentary form of blasting charge. My heart quickened as I studied the list again, then turned it over to find scrawled in the corner a note: "For clearing interior passage, urgent." I hastened back to Baker Street, finding Holmes already at the desk, poring over the partial map fragment beneath a magnifying lens. Without a word, I handed him the receipt. He examined it with a growing intensity. "Layton," he murmured, "claimed to be ignorant of Danforth's more dangerous dealings. And yet this is not the shopping list of a scholar. You think he lied? Think he—" Holmes tapped the edge of the receipt. "I think he knows more than he has said. Whether he is guilty or merely a coward, I cannot yet determine. But one thing is certain, Watson. He is not the innocent observer he pretends to be." And with that, Holmes retrieved his hat once more. "We shall call upon Mr. Layton. If nothing else, his reaction may be instructive." We confronted Layton that evening in his modest lodging off Paddington Street. The man answered the door himself, his complexion even paler than I recalled, and a tremor in his voice when he bade us enter. Holmes wasted no time. He placed the receipt upon the table between them, and fixed Leighton with a gaze as cold and measured as any I had seen. "You told me, Mr. Leighton, that you were not involved in any expedition beyond archival work," Holmes began. "Yet this receipt suggests otherwise." Leighton's eyes darted toward the paper, and for a moment I believed he might flee. Instead, he slumped into the chair and buried his face in his hands. "I did purchase those things," he said, his voice muffled. "But not for myself. The professor instructed me to do so, for a chamber he claimed had sealed shut after decades. I helped him procure the materials, that is all." Holmes studied him with unnerving stillness. "You withheld this," he said softly. "Why?" "I feared suspicion," Leighton said, "and shame. I did not wish to be associated with whatever it is he unleashed." Holmes remained silent for a long moment, then turned to me. "You see, Watson, the most convincing lies are those built upon truth. Leighton may not be a villain, but he is a gate through which something darker has passed." Outside, the night deepened, and with it, so too did the shadow gathering at the heart of this case. We returned to Baker Street past 10 o'clock. Holmes had said little during the ride, his thoughts turned inward. But upon arriving, we found a letter waiting on the tray. No stamp, no address, only our names written in a hand I did not recognize. Holmes opened it slowly, reading first in silence. Then, with deliberate calm, he laid it before me. The message was short, written in block capitals with no signature. "Cease your inquiry. There is nothing left to find. The dead owe no truths. This is your final warning." Beneath the line, a string of numbers had been added, meaningless at first glance. Holmes studied them with interest. "Caesar shift," he muttered. "A rudimentary cipher, but one meant to draw attention rather than evade it." He scribbled quickly, translating the message. The decoded phrase was stark. "The river washes away blood, not intent." Holmes tapped his fingers against his knee. "They want us to know they're watching, that they believe themselves righteous, even poetic. Do you think they mean to harm Eleanor?" "I think," Holmes said, "they already have. And I think they fear what her father left behind far more than we yet understand." He rose slowly. "Tomorrow we force their hand." It was well past midnight when the stillness of Baker Street was shattered by the shrill clatter of the bell. I had scarcely risen from my chair when Holmes flung open the door, already half-dressed, as though anticipating the summons. A constable stood breathless upon the threshold, his helmet askew and coat damp with rain. "There's been an explosion, sir. Off Windmere Lane. Lodgings belonging to a Mr. Thomas Leighton." At once, Holmes's expression sharpened. "Is he alive?" "Barely, sir. Shaken, but breathing. Neighbours pulled him clear." "Come, Watson," Holmes said with quiet urgency. "The game has changed." Within a quarter hour, we stood before the blackened ruin of a once modest house, now half collapsed, the air thick with soot and acrid smoke. The constables had cordoned off the street, though the crowd behind them pressed forward with typical morbid curiosity. The blast had torn through the front parlour and study, leaving the windows blown inward and the walls scored with char and splinters. Among the wreckage, a figure sat hunched beneath a soot-streaked blanket, Leighton, pale and trembling, his eyes fixed not on us, but on something far beyond. Holmes moved to him at once, his manner devoid of comfort, but not unkind. "You were not meant to survive," he said plainly. "But you have. That is something." Leighton's lips moved without sound, his hands still trembling beneath the blanket. I knelt beside him and gently offered a flask. He drank with difficulty, and after a long pause, his voice emerged, hoarse and fractured. "They came for me. They knew I'd spoken." Holmes's eyes narrowed. Then you are no longer merely a witness, Mr. Layton. You are a target. Tell us now, without omission, what it is they fear you will reveal. And thus the night's terror gave way to confession. Layton's voice, though ragged, grew steadier as the words came forth, urged on by Holmes's fixed gaze and the silent authority it conveyed. I had just returned from the library, he said. I lit a lamp, went to pour tea, and the floor beneath me gave a great shudder, a sound like the tearing of the world. Then fire, smoke. I don't know how I escaped. Crawled through the study window before the roof came down. He paused to breathe, eyes flickering toward the wreckage. They meant to kill me, not frighten, kill. Holmes remained silent for a moment, then said softly, Why now? Why, after all these weeks of silence, did they attempt your murder tonight? Layton shivered. Because I told you too much. Holmes inclined his head. Then it is time you told the rest. The assistant's shoulders sagged. Professor Danforth, he did confide in me once. Not the full nature of the discovery, but its gravity. He said it would ruin reputations, that it had to be hidden or destroyed. He never said why. Only that some truths were too dangerous to be left unburied. And the map? Holmes asked. Layton hesitated. It marked the place, yes, but not in a conventional manner. There were layers, codes within roots. He feared it would fall into the wrong hands. Holmes looked down at the scorched ground. It appears, Mr. Layton, that it already has. A shadow passed across his face. Not fear, but something quieter, colder. They've now shown their willingness to kill for it, Holmes said. Let us see what they are willing to die for. It was under the flickering lantern light of the constabulary's makeshift station that Layton gave his second, fuller confession. His hands shook as he spoke, not from guilt, I believed, but from the fraying edge of fear. Yes, I helped her burn it, he said. Miss Danforth, the night she received the final letter. Holmes folded his arms. You told us previously you knew nothing of the map's fate. Layton met Holmes's gaze with something akin to shame. I lied. I thought protecting her meant concealing the truth. But I see now it has only made things worse. Continue, Holmes said quietly. She came to me late, near midnight. She had the map, still rolled, her face pale as death. She said it had to be destroyed, that if it existed, others would come for it. I tried to reason with her, to hide it instead. But she was insistent. You watched her burn it, I asked. I aided her, he replied. She was trembling. I tore the parchment in halves. We fed them into the fire together. She wept the whole time. Holmes's voice remained even. And yet fragments remain. Layton nodded. She couldn't bear to destroy all of it. Said some part of it had to live, in case someone honest ever sought the truth. Holmes said nothing for a time, then turned his gaze out the window. She feared them, and rightly so, but she underestimated how far they would go. And now, because of it, we are left with only embers and shadows, unless we act swiftly. And act Holmes did, for he had already begun to assemble the puzzle with the cold precision of a surgeon's blade. By the time we returned to Baker Street, Holmes had pieced together enough to speak with authority, if not yet certainty. He laid out the journal, the receipts, the coded letters, each one a thread, seemingly disparate, now converging toward a single point. I believe, he said, that Professor Danforth uncovered the remnants of a lost expedition, not one catalogued in any formal record, but buried for political and personal reasons, colonial in nature, illicit in motive. He pointed to a passage in the professor's journal, burial not of the dead, but of what the living must not see. These were not merely artifacts, Holmes continued. They were trophies, evidence of plunder, perhaps even sacrilege, objects taken not from ruins but from the living cultures of the East. And the map? I asked. A ciphered guide to where those artifacts were hidden, not in a museum, not even in private hands, but sealed away, by Danforth himself it seems, as a final act of contrition. I felt a slow dread settle over me. You mean to say men would kill for stolen relics? Holmes looked at me steadily. For fortune, for pride, for fear of exposure. Yes, Watson, and more. For such men, silence is worth any price, including the life of a young woman. He turned back to the journal. They believe the secret is buried, but we shall unearth it before they bury us instead. It was shortly after dawn when Holmes resumed his study of the remaining fragments of the map, seated at the long table in our Baker Street sitting room. I observed him from my chair, watching as he bent over the charred remnants with a lens in one hand and a steel probe in the other. The light outside was pallid and thin, but Holmes required no more than silence and precision for his work. What struck me most was the patience with which he approached the task. A lesser man might have dismissed the blackened scraps as worthless. Holmes, however, treated each edge and contour as though it held the key to the enigma. He sorted the fragments into 3 small groups, arranged by degree of burning, from mere scorching to near total disintegration. He did not speak for some time, and when at last he did, it was with the calm tone that often preceded revelation. Observe, Watson, the manner in which the fire travelled, not with the randomness of fear, but with the precision of intent. These tears are uniform, not ragged. The outer corners were spared entirely, likely dampened in advance. You mean it was not panic that governed her hand? Precisely not, or if panic was present, it was guided by deeper instinct, or perhaps by design. Miss Danforth may have feared the map's possession, but someone else feared its preservation. He tapped one fragment with the point of his probe. Here, this edge curves to follow a boundary line. Not geographical, but structural. A ruin, a wall, whatever it was. Someone sought to destroy it more than any other part. I leaned forward. You think someone tampered with it before Miss Danforth burned it? Holmes's eyes flickered. Or someone instructed her where to burn. And with that, he turned toward the professor's journal once more, as if confident that the next clue lay not in the ashes of the map, but in the spaces between words left behind by the dead. The professor's journal had, until that point, yielded its secrets reluctantly, veiled as they were in half-phrases and cryptic notations. Yet Holmes, with a fluency born of long practice, resumed his deciphering with vigour. The entries in question appeared in the final pages of the book, penned with increasing urgency and unevenness, as though the writer had become aware of the narrowing circle around him. Holmes's finger paused at a margin note, lightly underscored. This, he murmured, was not meant to be read plainly. I leaned in to examine the scrawl, which read, "Better buried beneath sand than paraded in glass. Let those who seek legacy find only silence." Holmes was quiet for a moment, then reached for a folded sheet of onion-skin paper that had been tucked within the journal's cover. A list of coordinates, cross-referenced, with abbreviated names and cryptic initials. The professor speaks not merely of physical burial, Holmes continued. He refers to an act of conscience, a willful entombment of something he believed should never see the light of day. Artifacts, I asked, from his last expedition. More than artifacts, said Holmes. Evidence, relics perhaps sacred to others, taken under false pretenses. The kind of evidence that would tarnish not only reputations, but institutions. He tapped the page. Note the phrasing, let those who seek legacy. That is not the language of a man concerned with fortune, Watson. It is the confession of one haunted by the knowledge that what he possessed was not his to keep, nor his to expose. And with that, Holmes looked toward the fire, which makes it all the more valuable to those who seek not to honor it, but to possess or destroy it. Holmes leaned back in his chair, his steepled fingers resting beneath his chin, as he contemplated the convergence of motives revealed through the map's destruction and the journal's remorseful tone. These items, whatever their precise nature, he began, must possess value beyond that of coin, though undoubtedly their market worth would tempt any unscrupulous collector. I nodded. You believe it to be gold, jewels perhaps? Holmes shook his head. No, Watson. The true treasure here is provenance. These artifacts are not simply rare. They are sacred, looted perhaps under diplomatic cover, and concealed because their exposure would indict not merely individuals, but the expeditions themselves. Then our adversaries are not thieves alone, I murmured. Indeed, they are guardians of a secret, whether born of guilt or gain, we shall soon determine. And the danger lies not merely in their ambition, but in the righteousness with which they cloak it. I considered this as the fire crackled in the hearth. So we face men who believe themselves justified in murder, to protect that secret. Precisely, Holmes said, which is why they act without hesitation. The journal, the map, Miss Danforth herself, all perceived as threats. His expression grew distant. But in overplaying their hand, they have revealed something most precious of all, that fear still governs them. And fear, Watson, is the thread by which even the most cunning conspirator may be drawn into the open. And then, quite suddenly, he rose. It is time, he said, to make our presence known, and to see who comes out of the shadows to meet us. Holmes's plan, as always, relied less on spectacle and more upon the subtle manipulation of information. That same evening, he composed 3 anonymous notes, each crafted in a different hand, and sent them through intermediaries to select individuals known for their dealings in antiquities, particularly those with a reputation for discretion and moral flexibility. Each note contained the same tantalizing hint, that fragments of Professor Danforth's map had survived, and that coordinates pointing to the supposed site of the lost cache, located in an unmarked wadi on the edge of the empire, might soon be made public through an academic intermediary. No names were given, no locations confirmed, but the bait was unmistakable. Will they believe it? I asked, as he sealed the envelopes. Holmes allowed himself a rare smile. If their appetite has been whetted by fear, then a taste of hope will prove irresistible. He arranged for the letters to be posted from different parts of the city, and instructed me to place an innocuous advertisement in the Times, announcing a forthcoming lecture by a fictitious Dr. Elias Brigham on cartographic anomalies in recent trans-Euphratic excavations. That ought to stir their blood, Holmes murmured. Those who are watching will take note, and those who are desperate will come. But come where? I asked. To the place they believe the leak has begun, he replied. And there, Watson, we shall be waiting, not as scholars, but as hunters. He stood, gazing into the hearth as though he could already see the trap springing into place. For in the end, it is not the treasure that exposes the thief. It is the whisper of its return. It was midnight when Holmes and I took our position amidst the crumbling stone and rusted timbers of a long-abandoned warehouse that overlooked the lower docks. The place had once bustled with commerce, but was now left to the rats and river fog. A fitting stage, I thought, for a play such as ours. Holmes had chosen the location deliberately, ensuring that the whispers we had let loose, of a recovered map, of coordinates deciphered, and of a treasure soon to be unearthed, would lead the guilty to us. He had instructed Inspector Gregson to remain out of sight with 2 constables posted at the rear. We were to remain the bait. The only light came from a flickering gas lamp outside, casting long shadows that danced across the damp floorboards. Holmes stood utterly still beside a stack of empty crates, his eyes fixed upon the far entrance, his breath even. "You are certain she will come?" I whispered. "She must," he replied. "If not her, then one who acts in her stead. But I suspect the part cannot be delegated. Guilt rarely shares its stage." Even as he spoke, the outer door creaked open with painful slowness. A cloaked figure stepped cautiously inside, the shape slender and solitary, pausing only once before advancing deeper into the gloom. Holmes did not stir. "Steady, Watson," he murmured. "The play begins." And so, beneath the creaking beams and drifting river mist, the final act drew near. As the figure stepped closer, the lamplight touched her features, and I felt a shock unlike any in recent memory. "Good heavens," I breathed. "Eleanor?" Holmes said nothing, but I could see the faint tightening around his eyes. Miss Danforth stood before us, her cloak falling away to reveal the same composed bearing she had worn in our sitting room days earlier. But there was something altered now, a clarity in her gaze that no longer belonged to a victim in distress. She neither started nor faltered upon seeing us, but instead surveyed Holmes with a kind of weary recognition. "I thought it might be you," she said softly. Holmes inclined his head. "And yet you came." "I had to," she replied. "Too much has gone unsaid." My heart still reeled at the sight of her. "You were not taken?" She turned to me with a look not of guilt but of sorrow. "No, Doctor Watson. I staged it. The struggle near the embankment, the hat, all of it. I needed time, and I needed you to believe I was in danger." Holmes stepped forward. "You feared we were getting too close, but you could not bring yourself to vanish altogether. That was your mistake." "I had hoped," she said, "to destroy what my father left behind before others found it. But I failed. And now it must be faced." There was a moment's silence. Holmes's voice, when it came, was low and steady. Indeed it must, but not alone. Holmes stepped from the shadows and regarded Eleanor with an expression that was neither scornful nor cruel, but unflinchingly clear. "You feared that your father's legacy, if exposed, would taint more than his reputation. You feared it would taint your name as well, and undo the quiet, dignified memory you had cultivated of him." Eleanor said nothing. "You believed the destruction of the map would destroy the secret. But when that failed, you sought to mislead us. The letters, the threats, they were real, but they were not the whole of it. You received them, yes, but you never intended to deliver the map to your enemies. You meant to become the map's last guardian, and, if necessary, its executioner." Her hands trembled at her sides, though she tried to keep them still. Holmes continued, his tone clinical, yet not unkind. "You staged your own disappearance to distance yourself from suspicion, even as you searched for the cash your father had buried. But you underestimated our reach and overestimated your own resolve." Her voice emerged low and strained. "I only wanted to make it right, to keep the past buried." Holmes's gaze softened fractionally. "But the past, Miss Danforth, does not stay buried by silence. It festers. You sought to erase your father's sins, yet in doing so, you veiled your own conscience with deception." She raised her chin then, the shadows around her deepening. "Do you mean to arrest me?" Holmes shook his head slowly. "That is not my office. But truth has already begun its work. The rest will follow." For the first time that night, her composure wavered. She closed her eyes, not in defeat, but in quiet surrender. And as the warehouse held its breath, I understood the weight of her burden and the greater burden of having carried it alone. I watched her then, not as a suspect nor as a manipulator, but as a soul caught between ruin and redemption. Her figure seemed diminished, not by stature, but by the cost of what she had borne. The strength which had once held her upright now trembled beneath the gaze of truth. "Miss Danforth," I said gently, "no one doubts the nobility of your intent." She turned to me with a faint smile, one shaded more by sorrow than gratitude. "But intent, Doctor, does not erase consequence." Holmes stepped beside her, his voice quiet. "You feared your father's discovery would cause harm, and perhaps it would. But the silence you chose allowed others to act in shadow, with impunity. That is where the danger lies." She looked at him, her eyes no longer defiant, but searching. "And now?" "Now," Holmes said, "you have a choice. You may let the truth speak, or continue the deception and bury it beside your father." She lowered her head, and for a moment the only sound was the distant lapping of the tide beyond the warehouse wall. When she finally looked up, there was resolution in her voice. "Then let the truth speak." And with those words, the burden of guilt began at last to loosen its grip. It was with a weariness born not of exertion, but of prolonged tension, that Holmes and I returned to our lodgings on Baker Street. The lamps along the thoroughfare flickered in the mist, and the usual cacophony of the city seemed strangely muted, as though London itself held its breath in the wake of all that had passed. Inside, the familiar surroundings brought with them a sense of restoration. The ticking of the mantel clock, the scent of old tobacco, the creak of Holmes's chair as he resumed his place by the hearth, all were reassuringly unchanged. He spoke little at first, preferring the quiet occupation of lighting his pipe and staring contemplatively into the flames. I too took refuge in silence, my thoughts still tangled in the image of Eleanor Danforth standing alone in the gloom, her cloak falling from her shoulders like the curtain on some tragic stage. At length, Holmes stirred and turned his gaze toward me, that sharp, pale gleam in his eyes betraying the fact that his mind, far from resting, had merely been sharpening its conclusion. When he spoke, his voice was steady, low, and analytical. "There is, Watson, as you well know, great virtue in sequence." Holmes rose and paced slowly before the fireplace, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, a posture I had come to associate with the final articulation of a case. "Let us begin," he said, "with what was presented to us. A young woman in distress, a burned map, and the fear that something terrible had been set in motion. That fear, I believe, was genuine, but it masked deeper layers." He turned toward me. "From the outset, Eleanor Danforth was not simply reacting, she was calculating. The map was destroyed, not in blind panic, but in measured desperation. It had already been selectively damaged, its more incriminating portions likely removed by her father before his death. What remained was symbolic, a relic too dangerous to exist, yet too sacred to entirely erase." Holmes began to outline the progression of our inquiry. The journal gave us the first confirmation, veiled references to something illicit, buried, hidden from both scientific scrutiny and moral inquiry. The presence of threats, both authentic and possibly fabricated, raised the possibility of multiple factions at play. But it was not until Leighton's reluctant confession that the focus shifted. He paused. Leighton's involvement was partial, enough to assist in the destruction, but not in the orchestration. That role, I am now convinced, belonged to Eleanor herself. The clues she left behind, the staged disappearance, the intercepted letters, even the timing of her reappearance, were not failures in deception, but the flailing of a conscience at war with itself. He sank back into his chair, his voice softening. "She did not want to be caught, Watson. She wanted to be confronted. And with that, the pieces, each strange and fractured in isolation, came together with a grim and tragic symmetry. Holmes's tone grew quieter as he leaned back, his gaze once more fixed on the dancing fire. In my experience, Watson, guilt is seldom a blunt instrument. It coils, it tightens, it distorts even the noblest intentions. He reached for his pipe, letting the silence breathe between us before continuing. Eleanor Danforth was not driven by greed, nor even by ambition. She was driven by legacy, the weight of a name built upon the sins of a forgotten expedition. Her father, whatever his achievements, took part in the acquisition of cultural treasures under a veil of imperial dignity. And when the true nature of that act dawned upon him, too late, as it so often does, he sought to erase its trace. She inherited not only the fragments of that secret, but the moral burden of it. It twisted in her hands, became a duty, then a curse. She sought to erase it, thinking that in doing so, she might redeem the family name. But the truth does not bend to will alone. He looked at me with a distant sadness, rare in him, but never insincere. She believed she could contain the past by controlling its evidence. But in doing so, she became both warden and prisoner of it. There was nothing more to be said for a moment. Only the soft hiss of the coals answered him. As I later recorded the events of that case in my journal, I found my thoughts returning not to Holmes's deductions, brilliant though they were, but to Eleanor herself, not as the architect of a deception, but as a woman caught in a web of grief and moral inheritance. I could not bring myself to judge her harshly. Many a man has faltered beneath the weight of far lesser legacies. Her crime, if one could call it that, was born not of malice, but of anguish, the terrible fear that silence might preserve honor, and that truth, once loosed, would devour what remained of love. In the end, she chose to speak, and in that, perhaps, there lay her redemption. Fragile, incomplete, but real. I have often wondered what became of her. But Holmes, as always, said only this: she gave the truth its voice. The rest is not ours to decide. The fire had dwindled to glowing embers by the time Holmes stirred again. We had returned to Baker Street from our final meeting with Inspector Gregson, who had taken Eleanor Danforth's formal statement with an admirable blend of restraint and gravity. She had not been arrested, nor exonerated. Her fate, as Holmes had quietly remarked, now lay in less visible hands. The room was silent, save for the occasional pop of a coal shifting in the grate. Holmes sat opposite me, legs stretched out, his hands folded in his lap. On the table between us lay the charred fragments of the map, now brittle, blackened symbols of a truth nearly lost to fire and grief. He had placed them there deliberately, as though their silent presence might provoke some final insight. I could not help but look at them as one might look upon the ashes of a letter never read, something vital and unspoken now consigned to silence. Holmes had spoken little since our return. There was no triumph in his bearing, no air of solved mastery, only that peculiar stillness I had come to recognize as the mark of deep contemplation, not of logic, but of conscience. When he finally spoke, it was without shifting his gaze from the fire. "There are some truths, Watson," he said quietly, "that do not demand to be discovered. They merely wait to be understood." I said nothing, sensing that more would follow, and knowing it would be worth the wait. Holmes leaned forward then, the flickering glow casting his face in angular relief. He reached for a charred scrap and held it between forefinger and thumb, its blackened edge crumbling slightly beneath his touch. "This map," he said, "was meant to chart land, contours, borders, buried places, and yet it became something else entirely. A mirror, perhaps, one that reflected not only where a man had been, but what he could not leave behind. He set the fragment down with care, as one might handle a letter from the dead. Miss Danforth believed she could erase the stain of history by destroying its evidence. Her father, in his way, believed the same, burying not merely relics, but his complicity. And so it falls to others, always others, to unearth what was hidden, and to bear the weight of that unearthing. He looked at me then, his eyes sharp, but not cold. We chart maps, Watson. We draft boundaries, claim discoveries, assign names to things. But the soul does not yield to such measurements. It is not drawn in straight lines. It is a wilderness, marked by fear, by longing, by things undone. There was no bitterness in his tone, only a subdued melancholy that seemed to settle like the ash on the tabletop. Maps cannot chart the human soul, he said. They may show us where we are, but never why we went. I nodded slowly, unsure what to say. For once, even words felt inadequate. As I set down my pen this evening, I find my thoughts lingering not on the case's resolution, though it was as sound as any Holmes has ever given, but on the unseen contours of human intention that marked every step of it. Eleanor Danforth did not seek to enrich herself, nor even to deceive for personal gain. She was, in her own way, a custodian of memory, one burdened by the knowledge that the past does not sleep peacefully simply because we wish it so. Her tragedy lay not in wrongdoing, but in the desperate belief that silence might substitute for atonement. Holmes, for all his brilliance, did not judge her. He laid the facts bare, as he always does, and left conscience to the realm of others. And I, who have stood beside him through so many shadows, found in this case not simply a riddle to be solved, but a sorrow to be understood. Some truths must be uncovered, others merely witnessed, and some, like the last glowing embers of that fire, are best remembered quietly, for their warmth and for the burn they leave behind. As the last ember collapsed into ash, Holmes leaned back in his chair and fixed his gaze upon the fragments of the map that had once charted not merely land, but ruin. "You see, Watson," he said quietly, "some maps are drawn not to guide us, but to bury the truth. Her mistake was thinking the fire could consume memory, when memory, like guilt, seldom yields to flame." He paused. "One can burn the parchment, but the idea, the shadow it casts, that endures, as do the consequences." I stirred, unsettled by the weight of his words. "Do you believe she truly meant to silence the past, or merely delay it?" Holmes exhaled softly. "That, my dear Watson, is the peril of secrets. They ask not when they will be revealed, only who must suffer when they are. What do you think was the turning point in this case? The moment the truth began to slip through the cracks? Was it a hidden motive, a small mistake, or something deeper? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your theory. And if you enjoyed this mystery, do subscribe for more cases from the world of Sherlock Holmes. Feel free to share this story with a fellow detective in your life. Until the next case, stay observant.